So, this is the mighty human everyone's terrified of. Zia stood with her arms crossed, her tiny frame barely 2 feet tall. She looked Damon up and down like he was some sort of clumsy experiment gone wrong. You're just extra baggage with legs. Damon adjusted his tie, more out of habit than necessity, and tried to salvage whatever dignity was left after tripping over the threshold into the negotiation chamber. Extra baggage? Funny coming from someone who needs a booster seat to be seen in this room. Zia smirked, the kind of smirk that made you want to both admire her confidence and knock her off her metaphorical pedestal. Size doesn't equal strength, giant. I could probably take you down with one hand tied behind my back. I'd pay to see that. Damon shot back, crossing his arms and leaning slightly, too slightly, as the Krilltak-sized chair groaned under his weight. The smirk on Zia's face widened, her sharp teeth flashing like a predator sensing blood. You'll get your chance, she said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. Unfortunately for me, I'm stuck with you on this ridiculous peace mission. Unfortunately for you? Damon scoffed. I'm the one who has to explain human diplomacy to someone who thinks sarcasm is a weapon. Oh, it's a weapon, all right, Zia retorted. And judging by your reaction, it's highly effective. Their superiors, who had clearly had enough of their verbal sparring, intervened with an exasperated sigh. The Krilltak general leaned forward, his scaled face wrinkling in annoyance. Enough. You two are supposed to represent unity between our species, not provide comedic entertainment. Zia shrugged, unabashed. Damon muttered something under his breath about regretting every career choice that led him here. With a stiff nod from the general, they were briefed on their mission: deliver critical data to a neutral outpost on the edge of contested space. The journey was supposed to be routine, a simple symbolic gesture to cement trust between their species. Zia didn't look impressed. Damon didn't feel reassured. As they boarded the ship, the banter resumed almost immediately. Zia pointed at the human-designed controls, clearly built for hands much larger than her own. What's this? Do you have to wrestle the controls into submission, or is this some primitive human engineering? Damon rolled his eyes. It's called ergonomics. Maybe if your hands weren't the size of a child's, you'd appreciate it. Ah, yes, the famous human wit, she said, climbing onto the co-pilot's chair with the grace of someone who was used to improvising her way around a world built for beings twice her size. I've heard so much about it. Shame it's as overrated as your species' cooking. You've never even tried human food, Damon said defensively. Exactly, Zia replied with a grin. I've heard enough horror stories. I prefer to keep my taste buds intact. Their bickering continued as they launched into space, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a plasma blade. Damon couldn't decide if he was annoyed or entertained. Zia seemed to thrive on his frustration, her sharp tongue firing off quips like a well-oiled machine. Hours into the journey, Damon attempted small talk, hoping to lighten the mood, or at least distract himself from Zia's constant stream of insults. So, what's your deal? Were you born sarcastic, or is it something you had to work at? Zia raised an eyebrow, the corner of her mouth twitching in amusement. Oh, I've been perfecting my craft since the moment I could talk. Unlike humans, we Krilltak don't waste time on empty pleasantries. Efficiency is key. Right, Damon said dryly. Because nothing says efficiency like arguing for hours with your mission partner. I'm not arguing, Zia said, feigning innocence. I'm educating you. Consider it a cultural exchange. Damon shook his head, a reluctant chuckle escaping his lips. For all her barbs, Zia had a way of making even the most mundane moments feel alive. It was infuriating, and oddly captivating. Their camaraderie, or whatever passed for it, was put to the test when the ship jolted violently, alarms blaring as warning lights flashed across the console. Zia jumped into action, her small hands moving with precision over the controls. Damon, less graceful, scrambled to keep up. Hold on, Zia snapped, her tone all business now. We've got incoming fire. From who? Damon asked, his voice tinged with panic. Does it matter? Zia shot back. Just do something useful for once. Their ship took another hit, and the controls sparked ominously. Zia cursed in her native tongue, a string of guttural sounds that Damon didn't understand but fully grasped the meaning of. They were in trouble. As the ship spiraled toward a nearby planet, Damon braced himself, stealing a glance at Zia. For the first time, her bravado faltered, replaced by a flicker of worry. Guess I'll have to trust the giant oaf to survive this, she muttered, more to herself than to him. Don't worry, backpack, Damon said, forcing a grin despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. I'll keep you safe. Backpack? Zia echoed, her glare returning full force. Crash this ship, and I'll personally make sure you regret it. The ship hurtled through the atmosphere, its descent anything but smooth. Damon couldn't help but think that this partnership was going to be the death of him, or, at the very least, his sanity. The crash was a chaotic mess of fire, twisted metal, and gravity-defying jolts, but Damon managed to haul Zia out of the wreckage before the entire ship went up in flames. She came to with a groan, shaking off the dust and glaring up at him. You carried me? What am I, some fragile artifact? You were unconscious, and I wasn't about to leave you there as an alien barbecue. Damon shot back, dropping her onto her feet. You're welcome, by the way. Zia dusted herself off, her expression somewhere between annoyance and reluctant gratitude. Next time, just leave me. Krilltak warriors don't need rescuing. Sure, Damon muttered, scanning the dense jungle surrounding them. Next time, I'll let you become an exotic snack for whatever lives here. The jungle was alive with eerie sounds, chirps, rustles, and something Damon couldn't identify but felt certain he didn't want to meet. Zia was already moving, her small frame navigating the terrain with an agility that made Damon feel even more cumbersome than usual. Try to keep up, giant, she called over her shoulder. Or do I need to carry you this time? Damon rolled his eyes, muttering to himself as he trudged after her. Not even an hour in, and I'm regretting every decision that led me here. They walked for hours, their bickering filling the otherwise oppressive silence of the jungle. When Damon suggested setting up camp for the night, Zia scoffed. What, tired already? Humans really are as soft as they look. Call me soft one more time, and you're sleeping in a tree, Damon retorted, dropping his pack and starting to gather materials for a shelter. Zia watched him work with a bemused expression, occasionally tossing out unhelpful commentary. Is that supposed to be a fire? It looks like you're building a funeral pyre. Damon ignored her, though his patience was wearing thin. When the shelter was finally done, a sturdy structure that kept the creeping vines and suspiciously large insects at bay, he leaned back with a satisfied smirk. There. Try not to break it. Zia inspected the shelter with exaggerated skepticism, finally conceding with a shrug. Not bad, for someone who probably took 3 times as long as necessary. They sat by the fire, sharing rations that Zia immediately deemed an affront to edible things. Damon, however, was too hungry to care and tore into the prepackaged meals with gusto. Zia sniffed hers cautiously, wrinkling her nose. If I die eating this, I'm haunting you. You already haunt me, so no change there, Damon replied through a mouthful of food. Besides, Krilltak food probably tastes like motor oil, so I wouldn't talk. Zia smirked, leaning back against the shelter wall. Motor oil would be an improvement. But at least we don't have to chew for an eternity. What is this, a brick disguised as food? As the fire crackled, the jungle sounds grew louder, more menacing. Damon glanced into the shadows, his instincts prickling. You hear that? Zia's hand was already on her weapon, her playful demeanor evaporating. Stay close, giant. If something comes, I don't want you tripping over me in the panic. Damon gave her a look but didn't argue. Moments later, the underbrush rustled violently, and 2 alien predators emerged, slithering, fanged creatures with glowing eyes. Zia sprang into action, her movements precise and deadly, while Damon grabbed a branch and swung with more brute force than finesse. The fight was short but intense, ending with the creatures retreating, wounded and snarling. Zia turned to Damon, her face flushed with adrenaline. Not bad, Giant. For someone who fights like a drunk slug, you managed to hit something. High praise from someone who almost got eaten. Damon shot back, catching his breath. Zia smirked, but her expression softened slightly. Fine. You're not completely useless. Happy? Ecstatic. Damon deadpanned, sitting down heavily by the fire. Can we survive the night now, or do you have more life-threatening activities planned? Zia sat beside him, her usual sharpness giving way to something almost companionable. You might survive, if you don't snore loud enough to attract more predators. Good to know, Damon muttered, pulling his jacket tighter around himself. The firelight flickered between them, casting long shadows. Zia glanced at Damon, her tone quieter now. Why'd you really carry me out of the wreckage? Could have saved yourself and left me behind. Damon met her gaze, his expression serious for once. Because I don't leave people behind. Even ones who spend most of their time mocking me. Zia stared at him for a moment, then snorted, the moment of sincerity dissolving. You're an idiot. But I guess there are worse things to be. Damon shook his head, a reluctant grin tugging at his lips. Coming from you, that's practically a compliment. As the night wore on, the jungle seemed less threatening, their banter filling the spaces where fear might have crept in. Zia leaned back, her eyes half closed. Just don't expect me to carry you if we get attacked again, Giant. You're way too heavy. Noted, Damon replied, his voice laced with amusement. But you'd miss me if I wasn't here. Zia didn't respond immediately, her expression unreadable in the dim firelight. Maybe, she said finally, her voice softer than usual. But don't let it go to your oversized head. Damon chuckled, leaning against the shelter. For all the chaos and danger, he couldn't deny there was something oddly enjoyable about Zia's company. Even if she never let him live it down. The quiet of the jungle didn't last long. The low hum of approaching engines shattered the relative peace as Damon's head snapped up. Zia was already on her feet, her sharp ears catching the sound before he did. Rebels, she hissed, her voice low but urgent. They've tracked us. Damon's stomach dropped. Rebels? As in your people's rebels? Why would they be after us? Zia's glare was sharp enough to cut through the dim light. Not us. You. They'll see you as proof of our alliance with humans, proof they don't want out there. Her hands went to her weapons, her movements swift and practiced. Stay close. Try not to die. The sound of the engines grew louder. Damon followed her lead, crouching low as they moved deeper into the jungle. He wasn't exactly sure what he was supposed to do if they were caught. Zia, for all her height-related jokes, clearly had the skills to take on an army. Him? Not so much. The rebels arrived in force, 6 heavily armed Krilltak, their armor gleaming even in the dense underbrush. Zia gestured for Damon to stay quiet, her small figure blending into the shadows. For once, Damon listened without a snarky comeback. The first rebel stepped into view, his gaze scanning the area. Zia struck like lightning, her blade flashing as she disarmed him in seconds. The others were on her instantly, and Damon, against his better judgment, charged in to help. He grabbed the nearest rebel, using his size to his advantage. It was less a calculated move and more sheer desperation, but it worked. The rebel stumbled, thrown off balance by Damon's weight. Not bad for a giant, Zia muttered as she dodged a swing aimed at her head. Damon didn't have time to reply. Another rebel lunged at him, and he swung wildly, managing to land a solid hit. The fight was chaos, a blur of motion and noise. Zia moved like a dancer, her strikes precise and devastating, while Damon relied on brute strength and a growing sense of determination. Despite their best efforts, the numbers weren't in their favor. Zia and Damon found themselves cornered, backs to a tree as the remaining rebels closed in. Any brilliant ideas, Giant? Zia panted, her blades raised. Working on it, Damon replied, scanning their surroundings. His eyes landed on a large vine hanging above them. Think you can keep them busy for a second? Zia rolled her eyes. I'm already doing that. What are you, She didn't finish the sentence, watching as Damon grabbed the vine and pulled with all his strength. The heavy branch it was attached to came crashing down, scattering the rebels and giving them a moment to breathe. Zia stared at him, a mix of disbelief and reluctant admiration on her face. Okay, that was surprisingly effective. Don't sound too impressed, Damon said, his breath coming in heavy gasps. Wouldn't want you to hurt yourself. Their reprieve didn't last long. The rebels regrouped quickly, their leader barking orders. Damon could see the determination in their eyes. They weren't going to give up. We need to move, Zia said, her tone urgent. Now. They bolted, weaving through the jungle as the rebels gave chase. Damon could feel his lungs burning, but he kept going, driven by adrenaline and the sharp awareness that slowing down wasn't an option. Zia led the way, her smaller frame darting through the trees with ease. Damon wasn't quite as graceful, but he managed to keep up, his larger strides compensating for his lack of agility. You really need to work on your cardio, Zia called back, her voice tinged with humor despite the danger. Not the time, Damon replied, struggling to catch his breath. They reached a clearing, the dense foliage giving way to open space. Zia came to an abrupt stop, her eyes scanning the area. This isn't good, she muttered. Damon followed her gaze, his heart sinking as he saw the rebels closing in from multiple directions. Got any more vines to pull? Not this time, Zia said, her voice grim. She squared her shoulders, her blades ready. Looks like we make our stand here. Damon didn't like their odds, but he didn't have much choice. He picked up a hefty branch, gripping it tightly as the rebels surrounded them. If we die, I'm blaming you, he said, his voice laced with nervous humor. Blame me all you want, Zia replied. Just don't get in my way. The rebels attacked, and the clearing erupted into chaos. Zia fought with ferocity, her movements a blur as she took on two rebels at once. Damon held his own, using his size and strength to keep them at bay. It wasn't pretty, but it was effective. The tide turned when Zia managed to disarm the leader, her blade pressed to his throat. Call them off, she demanded, her voice cold and commanding. The leader hesitated, his eyes darting between Zia and Damon. Finally, he signaled for his men to stand down. Zia didn't lower her blade. Leave. Now. The rebels retreated, their leader glaring at Zia before disappearing into the jungle. Damon sank to the ground, his limbs trembling from exhaustion. That was intense. Zia sheathed her blades, her expression unreadable. You did better than I expected, Giant. Maybe you're not completely useless after all. High praise, Damon said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He looked at her, a hint of a smile on his face. You know, for someone who keeps calling me a giant, you sure don't mind hiding behind me. Zia smirked, her sharp teeth flashing. Don't let it go to your head. You're still slow and clumsy. Sure, Damon replied, his grin widening. But you'd miss me if I wasn't here. Zia didn't respond immediately, her gaze lingering on him for a moment before she turned away. Let's just get out of here before they come back. They started walking, the tension between them easing into something more familiar. Damon couldn't help but think that, for all her sharp edges and biting remarks, Zia wasn't as bad as she wanted him to believe. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to think the same about him. The jungle finally quieted as they moved deeper into the dense foliage, the adrenaline from the ambush slowly fading. Damon glanced at Zia, her small frame moving ahead of him with practiced confidence. He was sore, exhausted, and acutely aware that he had no idea where they were going. So, fearless leader, do you actually have a plan, or are we just wandering aimlessly until something else tries to kill us? Zia stopped, turning to face him with her usual smirk. The plan is to survive, Giant. If you've got a better one, I'm all ears. Damon sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Survival works for now, but it'd be nice to know we're heading somewhere that isn't just another death trap. Relax, Zia said, leaning against a nearby tree. We're far enough from the rebels for now. Besides, I thought humans liked a little adventure. Isn't that why your kind is always poking around where you don't belong? Oh, sure, Damon replied, dropping his pack onto the ground and sitting down heavily. We love being chased through jungles by angry rebels. It's our favorite pastime. Zia chuckled, the sound surprisingly light compared to her usual sharp tone. You know, for all your complaining, you didn't do half bad back there. Maybe you're not as useless as I thought. Damon raised an eyebrow. Was that a compliment? Don't get used to it, Zia said, folding her arms. I still think you're oversized and clumsy. But you've got potential. High praise coming from someone who can barely see over the underbrush. Damon shot back, grinning as Zia's smirk widened. They sat in silence for a moment, the firelight from their makeshift camp casting flickering shadows on the trees. Damon leaned back, his head resting against the bark of a tree. You ever get tired of the whole tough warrior act? He asked, his tone teasing but curious. Zia raised an eyebrow. Act? This isn't an act, giant. This is who I am. Uh-huh, Damon said, his grin widening. Because I'm sure deep down, you're just a big softy. Zia rolled her eyes. Keep dreaming, human. But there was a hint of something in her tone, a flicker of warmth that Damon hadn't heard before. He decided to push his luck. You know, for all your talk about how humans are big and slow, you didn't seem to mind when I had your back there. Zia's gaze flicked to him, her expression unreadable. You're strong, she admitted, her voice quieter than usual. Stronger than I expected. But don't let it go to your head. Damon laughed softly. Don't worry, I won't. I've got you to keep me humble. Damn right, Zia said, but there was no bite in her words this time. As the fire crackled between them, Damon felt the tension that had defined their partnership begin to ease. He couldn't help but notice the way Zia's sharp edges seemed to soften in the firelight, her usual smirk giving way to something more genuine. You're not so bad yourself, he said, his tone light but sincere. Zia snorted. Don't start getting sentimental on me, giant. I might actually start to believe you. They shared a brief laugh, the sound echoing softly in the stillness of the jungle. For the first time since the mission had begun, Damon felt a strange sense of ease. Sure, they were still stranded in a hostile environment with no clear way out, but somehow, it didn't seem so bad. As the night wore on, the conversation turned to lighter topics, stories of their respective worlds, cultural quirks, and the occasional playful jab. Zia told him about the strict traditions of the Kriltak, the relentless training that had shaped her into the warrior she was. Damon, in turn, regaled her with tales of human absurdities, from bizarre Earth customs to questionable culinary choices. You're telling me, Zia said, barely containing her laughter, that humans actually eat something called hot dogs. It's a delicacy, Damon replied, trying and failing to keep a straight face. You haven't lived until you've had one. Zia shook her head, her shoulders shaking with laughter. You humans are ridiculous. Maybe, Damon said, his grin widening. But you love it. Zia rolled her eyes, but the smile that lingered on her lips told him she wasn't entirely disagreeing. As the conversation waned, a comfortable silence settled over them. Zia leaned back, her gaze fixed on the stars visible through the canopy above. You're different from what I expected, she said finally, her voice soft. Different how? Damon asked, his curiosity piqued. Stronger, Zia said, glancing at him. Not just physically. You don't give up, even when the odds are stacked against you. It's admirable. Damon met her gaze, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. Coming from you, that almost sounds like a compliment. Don't get used to it, Zia said, but there was no heat in her words. They sat in silence for a while longer, the firelight dancing between them. Damon couldn't help but feel that, despite their rocky start, they'd managed to find some semblance of common ground. And maybe, just maybe, they weren't so different after all.